Thank you all in advance for being part of a uncanned art conversation. Like, I think we should all feel good about that. Like, it's unpredictable. We don't know what will happen. So, one could call you a visionary artist, right? That's a fair term. One could see that written in a bio or something like that. Maybe you could tell us what that might mean to be a visionary artist.
Well, I guess that just starts with being present with your material, being present with that medium, but not having any boundary of what can come from that connection, what can come from working deeply with that medium, and allowing it to take conversations with other fields that are also deeply involved in that medium and see what comes of that.
So a couple of questions. What medium, for example? What would be a medium?
So we're just going to deep dive right away. There's no... Okay, everybody. Okay. So, a medium, I guess, in a traditional sense might be paint or might be metals or might be graphite. But the medium I'm talking about is an atomic medium. That medium is something that all fields share. Words are important. I'm still learning the right words to use. But indeed, this isn't a work that art is in conversation with the sciences. Indeed, when you're working with the atomic medium itself, all fields share within that medium. So it's not an intersecting of fields, it's not an intersecting of disciplines. It's simply allowing all disciplines to be in practice with the same material. And as sculptor, my job is to work that clay, push and pull that medium. And in pushing and pulling that medium, I have access to all fields.
Yeah.
So I don't separate out all of that.
So medium, atomic medium, we could understand, and also the word clay would, like, you're talking about forging large pieces of metal into what any one of us walking by might just call a sculpture, maybe a public sculpture. So maybe say a little bit more then about why such a thing would be a visionary thing.
Perhaps maybe because I'm not spending too much time repeating a certain object. So I began as a painter. I still consider myself always a painter. But then in moving in sculpture, I've already been moving from sculpture too, into just these objects that I consider artworks that are these expressions of all fields working the same medium. So they may not be encountered necessarily as a sculpture or an object, but conceptually and materially as an artwork. That's where the work is right now. But with the sculpture, which is to your question, it definitely occurred to me in the artist practice, when you're in the studio, when you're at the foundry, when you're in the forge, and you have all of this touch with your work, why cannot a viewer also have the same experience as the person creating the form? You're missing out on the largest sensory apparatus of your body. It's not your eye, it is your skin. So that aspect of touch is an ability to be in contact with yourself. It's the material in contact with itself. So as you were saying, if you're walking by and you're encountering one of these sculptures, it's an opportunity it's conceived and constructed to be engaged as a full sensory encounter. So in essence, it's the material in contact with itself.
So yes, so touching the work is not only encouraged, but there's a kind of collaboration of the viewer with the work in that sense, because a little bit of the work rubs off on us and we rub off on it.
Oh, that's like one of my favorite things.
Yeah. Didn't you want one of your pieces to kind of erode into a pile of dust
Yes.
in the gallery as its
Yes.
apotheosis? Yeah.
Yes.
Did it happen?
Well, that was the idea, right? The idea that the museum director, this is Lisa Melandri from the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis. The notion was, what I was commissioned for was this idea I was going to pull off, which were these 11,000-pound compressions that could slough off by human touch. And then at the end of the show, months later, if you were to return, you could kick around a lot of iron grit on the floor, and the show would be collected, and all of that material would go into city works, into the public works. And so that was that sense of material continuation.
Yeah.
However, and I mean, I guess I'm going ahead and saying this publicly, up to about a year before the opening of that show, my tests were failing in being able to say to Lisa Melandri, I can absolutely assure you that as people are sloughing off, 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds of iron grit isn't going to fall on someone, and I couldn't, because none of my tests were proving that out. So although I was very successful in being able to form a very novel way of compressing iron grit, it's not casting. Casting is a process where you're taking a material, you're heating that material into a molten liquid, and then you're allowing it to cool back into a solid in the form you call an artwork. In this particular case, there's not heat involved at all. It was pure compression. And so I ended up using a 1% binder. It was basically a sugar that allowed the form to, like the first quarter inch could slough off, and then you reached basically a complete compressed form. So yes, you could still have a little bit of sloughing, but it did not, it wasn't collected and repurposed as part of the infrastructure of the
A little
city.
bit of sloughing, that's good.
A little bit of sloughing.
I think I'll take that for my next essay, title, whatever it's about. So you mentioned St. Louis, so just a shout out, like we're both from St. Louis. We both grew up there, so that's nice. But going back to the idea of visionary then, so how does visionary connect with the sloughing and the touching? Like, for example, I live in the Bay Area now, so you have a piece on Howard Street between 3rd and 4th. Is it called Genesis? Yes. So it's a large sculpture. I don't know if it's in the slide deck here, but so if I put my hand on it, maybe just wanting to find some mooring as I walk to the train station or something like that, and said something to myself, some other strangers who would look at me oddly for saying it, but if I just said, I am here, and by virtue of that touch, would that be a misguided way of interacting with your work?
Not at all. As a matter of
Okay.
fact, you can sit upon it, you can rest upon it, you are allowed full physical agency with the piece.
I hear you. No one would come running and tell me to get off the sculpture. I get that. I think the question is, I guess it has to do with the first word that I would have uttered, the word I.
Of course, yes.
Is that a correct word to use in connection with your work and towards your, with respect to your visionary impulses and dreams?
Of course, because the atoms of your material body share the same material history as the atoms of that sculpture.
Okay.
And the atoms of your body have, at some point in this closed biosphere, been in exchange with many forms.
So I'm made of the stars as the metal is, and there's some big bang that encompasses us both, but not me exclusively because I write about art or something like that, but because, like us all, because I'm human.
I feel that there's something about the material universe that's in the experience of being human that allows the material to advance in a way that it wouldn't in other forms. And so I'm very curious with the life that I'm given to see how to advance materials together in a responsible, holistic fashion, of course, because human beings aren't the only ones who have been evolving this.
So sure. So I've talked a little bit about the American Civil War in the past couple of days, just with people. So it seems to be coming out of left field here. But the idea is, if you think of going to Washington D.C. and there'll be a sculpture of a man on a horse, and it's General Meade or someone like that. That's an idea of public sculpture. The piece in San Francisco, or on the High Line piece, which incidentally is in the very neighborhood where Helen Frankenthaler lived as a young woman. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, like 10th and 25th, 10th and 24th. Interesting.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So, but public sculpture, we go from a man on a horse that's representing civic ideals, and some of those men on horses get torn down, and we've heard the land acknowledgement and so on. Then there's a big piece of steel in San Francisco or in New York. Like, tell us about your work, your visionary idea of our porousness and the work's porousness and our oneness, which makes our individuality, so-called, seem a very meager thing indeed, right? How do you understand it in terms of a history of public sculpture in the United States? Is there any commonality between the man on the horse and Un, or is it a totally different conception?
I'm going to answer your question by really extending it a bit.
Okay. All right.
A painting is also a public sculpture. So what I'm trying to do is really extend terms, extend them to the point where how they've been previously defined needs some rearranging to truly advance the whole vernacular of how even a public sculpture could be also considered a painting. And with that, the whole notion of SoakStain, there is a very, very direct relationship between the work of Helen Frankenthaler, her technique and her practice of SoakStain, and how I see that as a practice that then is in conversation as a public sculpture. And that is because her work, by diluting that paint and being able to stain and dye the fibers of a fabric, and that vignette, and a side note on this, dyeing textiles is many people's, it is as ancient as it is to be human. But in 1950s, in New York, in this art movement, and what is specific to my work is her sense of coating that fiber of that canvas, the color of the vignette, the edge of the vignette is not a termination. It continues with the canvas. That canvas continues off the wall, into the air, as your body, as the atomic medium, within this biosphere and within space itself.
So the soaking and staining and porousness and permeability between self and world, between self and sculpture, makes our, like this very room is a kind of soaking and staining.
Yes, and in that way, that sense of public sculpture, there's this sense of a collective, a public collective, and also this incredible intimacy. And when you can be completely present with something, as you would in that sense of complete personal intimacy, and yet also have that be a public collective act, I think we're beginning to get into that beautiful back and forth of what I'm looking for from art.
Yeah, so I want to praise you for praising us in the sense that it seems to me by putting a public sculpture up, you are understanding that many people will walk right by it And you're understanding the relatively impoverished and diminished conceptions of a public and of art now, in the sense that people ask, as I tell my students at Stanford, people ask, it's really very striking, people ask almost nothing of art, in my opinion. They don't really ask for it to do anything or be meaningful in any particular way, just kind of a thing out there. So public sculpture, you know, has a kind of ignominious ongoing presence, but it's just a thing to walk by. But I praise you because you don't believe that, or you aspirationally want to create a public, and you refuse to relinquish the idea of a public around that a work of art can center and cause to, maybe the religious connotations of the word I'm about to use are appropriate, but congregate a work, you know, a public that would congregate, if not directly around the work, then at least in communion with it. So where does that come from? Like this that seems to me very visionary.
I think it's art that is aware of, in conversation with, but I'm going to use the term indifferent.
Yes.
It's indifferent to market.
Yes.
It's indifferent to trend.
Yes.
It's aware of it. It's in conversation of it. It might even be at the very center of it. Doesn't mean that it's an outsider, but it is a directional pointer. And I feel that when art starts to have that deadening, it's usually the sign that trends, tastes, we're saturating, we're losing meaning, other paths are moving forward. This is a natural cycle of things, I think. But I'm incredibly aware. I read, I'm involved, I'm aware of all of this, but it's not part of my studio practice at all. As a matter of fact, it's completely silent of it. I am not working with that when I'm at practice.
You're not trying to make statements or intervene in a current discourse. You're trying to play a long game and remind us of who we elementally are.
Yes, this is so great.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I should write that down.
This is such an incredible experience, you
Yeah.
guys. Just okay. Anyway. All right.
Yeah. Is it our switch time? Yeah. I see. I knew. You didn't even have to say it. Okay. It's like in football. We will receive. Yeah. Second half. We will receive. Okay. Go ahead. All right. Oh wow, it's so different over here. Wow. Okay. What were we talking about? Hey. Okay.
Oh man. Now what?
Yeah. So. Right. But you're just ignoring the contemporary whatever's happening because you're playing a long game, and abstraction must be a key part of that, right? Because one of the virtues of abstraction is that it can be very dated, of course, but it can also not be dated. So maybe you want to address like why these these circular shapes and these. Go ahead.
This is so great. Okay. So I'm just going to run with a little bit of what you just said, the long game. So let's talk about abstraction a bit. If I was to still kind of cue in the work a bit, I would say it's still heavily involved in the abstract. Now, with the long game, so the very first time the human hand went to the cave, right, with pigment, I feel that there's the long game. That there is a millions of years in this evolution of that mark making, that language, that vernacular of the abstract. I'm going to kind of just keep it there because I don't necessarily want to call it abstract art. Right. But it is the abstract, and it is that sense of, like you were saying, I am here. Mm-hmm. But that's really just the material in contact with itself. Again, keep in mind, this is miraculous. We're animated matter. I mean, just think about that for a second. This is truly miraculous, that the material gets to have an opportunity to look at itself, to be in contact with itself, to hear itself.
You mean a piece of metal is otherwise than in your art, like resigned to an alienated, lonely existence, right? But
Okay,
then
all right,
one
well,
day,
yes,
it's like
yes.
friend.
Friend.
Yeah, friend. But that's, I'm talking as the sculpture.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, these are, okay, there's lots of time scales here, but Earth is a relatively closed biosphere. There is a lot of exchange of atoms that have been in many, many forms over a very long period of time. An atom in my blood, an iron of atom in my blood has the same signature, has the same identity as an iron of atom in the work, as an iron of atom in a distant core of a sun. These are indissoluble atoms, nature, and it has been rearranging over a very long time scale. So I'm just interested in, I think also having a focused attention of our sensory apparatus, because we can't lose sight that we are a sensory node of the material. This is extraordinary, and it's scientific too.
Well, on that note, I mean, I want to think about the peacefulness of your work in the sense that I could imagine these same ideas as being kind of stridently expressed in the sense of, don't you see, don't you recognize, don't you understand? We're all kind of living in a kind of blindness or lack of awareness of our potentialities and our relation to the universe as opposed to our separation from the universe and our everyday wish to master it, to control it, to dominate it, to destroy it, etc. But there is a kind of peacefulness to not just your person, but to these large forms as well. So and then that peacefulness risks being ignored, it seems to me, because the world responds only to different stridencies, anger, different evident emotions which fill the news cycle. So how are you at peace with your peacefulness?
That's the long aim.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you know, in being an artist, I think that it is something that I'm incredibly comfortable with. And I do feel that there is a lot to be said. I'm all for progress. I'm all about the progress of technology as a tool, but I'm also all about the idea of our material body as a tool that is still evolving in each one of us in this room, in each one of us. It's not that evolution has just stopped, right? It's not in stasis, it's not in hypostasis.
Yeah.
And I feel that there is, I personally have far more interest in how we are honing and evolving our sensory apparatus. There's still so much more to know. There's still so much more to discover, and to not short end that with a tool that otherwise would be deadening an aspect. It's like using non-animate matter to assist animate matter. I'm very interested in the evolution of animate matter.
Yeah, so that to me connects with humility instead of hubris, and I think of the way your forms are often, if this is the right word, incomplete, or they imply a further trajectory, or there's something invisibly that's held within, kind of cupped within their forms, and that makes me think of, something kind of, it might seem a little ironic with respect to your work, but the humility of the artist in making these huge, heavy, massive, very public sculptures. there's in the making, the humility in the making, but you know, there's also a sense of the humility in the sense that these works posit and portray an unknown, right?
Yeah.
And they allow us to kind of cup or hold something that we can't know. And they make the work of art into the experience of being in the presence of something we cannot know, but that is a part of ourselves. And, you know, I guess my question is just, that seems to me of a piece with the peacefulness. It's the peacefulness of the night sky, as beheld from here, for example. But, you know, tell me, I mean, is there a religious component to that? Because it implies kind of communing with something that is beyond us.
No, but I think that the realization of knowing the material truth of things is so expansive. It's so difficult to process. It's so extraordinary that in there lies a lot of what I think spiritual or religious works work within. But for me, to me, it resides all within the material.
Yeah. So it's all pressed and compressed, to use your term from before, gathered.
Yeah.
And condensed into a very real world, touching, I am here kind of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You know, these words like humility and peace, you know, and visionariness as they relate to your art make me think of the adage that everyone, when they're 5 years old, is an artist. But the only people who really become artists are the ones who still stay in touch with their crayons and their pieces of paper. So what in your childhood, like looking back, allows you to foretell all the things you're talking about today?
As a child, I used to try to conceive of infinity. So I would sit in my bed at night and I would kind of pretend that I was looking down at myself from the top of the room. And then I would just keep going, you know, trying to imagine what I'm seeing. You know, seeing my state, seeing like the earth. And I would try to go as far as I can until I would try to get the sense of what infinity felt like. And this was a very childlike understanding of trying to figure that out. But I wanted to physically try to experience what that, was that a sensation? Like, would I knock out? Like, could I feel it? And that was something that I did a lot. I would be about age 5 or 6.
Third grade, a haiku?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Why don't you give it to us? Yeah.
Okay.
It's
This
not
was something
long.
that came up.
Okay, go ahead.
In third grade, on yellow lined paper, this amazing teacher, like shout out to the amazing teachers in this world, she was teaching us how to write a haiku. And I came home one day with this haiku that I wrote that was, wisdom is learning, all trust is in myself, the sun is the way. I don't actually understand what would make this young little child think these things. As an adult, I look back and I just think, what was going on there?
I'm going to take that for my learning outcomes on my syllabus.
But I will say, public television, I don't know, but I am a child of the 70s. Carl Sagan, in the 70s, were several things happening all at once that was greatly informing me, and I took attention on levels that were probably more subconscious and other conscious, but minimalism in art and in music. And what we were doing, we launched Voyager 1 and 2 in the 70s. just coming off of landing on the moon. Think about that picture from Earth that was taken. I was born in a generation that already had this image of looking back on ourselves, the actual image of Earth. So, I mean, aspects of this, I'm sure were coming forward, but yeah, later to learn, of course, because I began with piano, then I studied stars. I had an astrophysics internship at NASA, just an internship, folks, but it was NASA, with a SETI principal investigator, Lawrence Doyle. And I was really fully engaged with that moment because it was actually going to maybe change the trajectory of my path and just completely get involved in large structure cosmology, get involved in astrophysics, but I didn't. I went back to art and continued on being a sculptor. But as a young person, that what space teaches you in how to see, what space teaches you about suns as our material forges. They are the generator of all of our periodic table of elements. Was already giving me my palette. It was already giving me the crayons I was going to work with.
So art was the encompassing thing, like greater than science, as it were, in terms of having the most to say and the most material, vitality.
Art has that open foundational freedom that sciences can't give themselves at the start. So I feel that is, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking that, I'm just reminded of how I actually worked at the planetarium in St. Louis.
Really?
I probably sold you a snow globe or something back in the day. I should have mentioned it to David to include in my bio. Yeah. You didn't go to Laserium, perchance?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Oh, Pink Floyd? You're a Pink Floyd person?
I actually...
Yeah. Oh, anyway, that's a separate thing. But yeah, that was, yeah.
Wow.
I didn't operate the laser. I just want to be clear about that. Okay, anyway, yes, so art as the encompassing thing, and yet I'm struck by, a kind of art that I like is reaching out beyond the self and going beyond the beggarly little word I, like the letter I, and its consolidated properties and activations and measly importance and so on. But I tend to like, maybe this is the romantic in me and the person who was very poor at science, but I like the blind feeling around, and even as it's connected to a kind of stupidity or things like that. And you're the opposite of that. I think you are a Sagan-like visionary, to come back to that word. You see things, you apprehend things. And I wonder if you could speak to the difference, or if there is finally a difference between my mode and yours.
I'm a spelunker. It's not that I know what I am doing in that way. I am also exploring and discovering. But I will say this, and this gets back to Helen Frankenthaler. When she saw that Pollock had been working with the canvas on the floor. But she engaged with it with her entire body, her knee, her foot. She would step onto it. She would lean over it. And again, in that sense of, our touch, our sense of touch, our sense of skin is our largest sensory apparatus. She was orienting herself, to your point of orienting. She was orienting herself, like you guys are here in the room, completely at different aspects of the composition, constantly reorienting that. And for me, that's a matter of my own practice too. It is coming at the composition from different lines of sight, from full sensory engagement, full sensory alertness, and seeing where that goes. And so oftentimes there will be a series where I'll give a certain parameter and I will work that parameter until something different happens.
Yeah, so it's about being within is connected to an exploration that is about spelunking and as opposed to like having a telescope with you at all times. Okay, but a variant on my question, your example of Helen makes me think of what I really like about her work, and like even better than Pollock's, and I like Pollock's work, is it's so grounded in her physical space. Like she would have made some of her paintings in basically like a room but the size of this stage, and you can really feel that. And so the bodily presence you're talking about is very palpable, lovingly grounded in a very specific place. It's not cosmic in that way. Whereas Pollock's work has titles like Comet, Reflection of the Big Dipper, Galaxy. There's a lot of implication of the cosmic. And I'm not saying that those two are opposed, because I gather that this stage might as well levitate as our grand finale, which is coming up shortly, by the way. And what is it, like the ceiling is the floor of the metaphysical or something like that? Yeah, right. So we will ascend shortly. You'll be saying to your friends, you should have gone to this. All right, anyway. But, you know, you maybe want to speak to the way that painting in a room with a radiator in the corner and an open window on West End Avenue and the traffic noise outside is cosmic too. Go ahead.
Yes. So didn't Pollock say something like, I don't paint nature, I am nature, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so that to me is on point. However, to me, the better point is if you can say something, and you said this in your book, Fierce Poise, on Helen Frankenthaler, that there was a depth within versus a depth of self.
Yeah.
So when
Tell
you
me
say,
what I meant. Yeah.
well, when we're talking about someone saying, I am nature, contained in the intention of that, is that a depth of self or is that a depth within? So what I would say about, so let's leave that aside for Pollock, but for Frankenthaler, and you also said this in your book, was that there was a critic that once said that her work was perfectly scaled for the human one-on-one.
Exactly.
It wasn't the microscope, it wasn't the telescope.
Yes.
It was the radiator, it was the open window, it was a human body in a composition.
That's what I love about it, yeah.
And yes, ascent.
That was her best friend. Yeah, so that's our ascent? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, no.
Yeah, well, no, I think there's something too, like in my own kind of perhaps sentimental and romantic sense of just the here and now and the beautiful limitation of being a human being. So, you know, that just what happens in the room, the event in the present, and that being all that it is lovely for me. And maybe that's a way that I respond to her work, but it is even within that kind of reaching out to something which your work helps teach me about. I think I'm going to stop there, and we're going to open it up for questions. I will be the moderator. We have some microphones that will go around, and I'll try to keep track here by swiveling. But the floor is now open for 3 or 4 questions.
So when you were speaking, I was thinking of Lucretius on the nature of things.
Yes.
And have you read
Yes.
that and studied that book? Okay, and just expand on that.
On the Nature of Things is a series, it was a title of a series of monoprints that I did. Any point in human history when there has been writing that brings us into connection, into discovery, into further words with this atomic medium, it is deeply connected with with my work, and then all of those works are deeply connected. And so thank you for thinking of that.
Yeah, some of your sculptures, as you know, are quite large and very heavy. And as an artist, how does it feel to have to translate an idea in your head to having to physically create it with people that are under your, you have to tell them what to do, actually. And how does that feel to have that?
That's an excellent question, because as painter, you essentially can do all of it yourself. And then when you start to work in sculpture, you're immediately involved with industrial cranes and foundries and all kinds of things. And I love that. I love that because it allows me to delve into their discipline, have an understanding how they approach the same material. Then we're in conversation together, and then we pull in other disciplines that are in the same conversation with the same medium. And then you are at work together creating something that is greater than any one part. And I'm very transparent about who I work with and how important that is. I think oftentimes there is like this elusive shroud that an artist is making all aspects of their work. And I feel that it's important to be fully transparent of that process, because to me, every single aspect of a work is its own genius. You can't have a fantastic idea and then not have fantastic people work with you, So I've always been very open to it, and it's allowed me to be in conversations with people from all over the world. And this gets to a little bit to, a lot of the work is in scale and measurement large compared to maybe this bottle of water. I also work in the scale of the bottle of water, and because of my work in astrophysics in that time period, I'm rather indifferent to scale. So the idea of building something, Earth to me is large scale. So anything that's smaller than Earth isn't that big. So, so that's how I look at it. So you just blur scale. But with that also has come a responsibility in materials, how we're using materials, how we're understanding the carbon cycle. I'm not using materials in the way I was 10 years ago. I'm using materials completely differently now. So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
So I have a question for both of you, and I don't know, is that fair? Can I ask 2 questions?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. So Christine, you have talked a lot about the cosmos and levitating, but I've never heard you use today the word void. And I'm just curious, do you think of void or you negate void?
It is true. So the material universe is only 4% of the entire sense of what the universe is, right?
Right.
So it's very little. And out in space, atomic medium is very spread apart. But it coalesces, under its own gravitational force, and it starts to come form from interstellar medium. So I think as sculptor, it's pulling that medium into form, that pushing and pulling of form. I totally acknowledge void. Space is like one of my favorite things. But I acknowledge it. Does that help answer it? I totally include it. But you're right, I hadn't mentioned it. Thank you.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay.
And the question I have for you is, very early on in this talk, you mentioned that viewers, in looking at art, they don't ask anything of the art. And you said you use this when you talk to your students. Could you just explain that a little bit more? Because I'm very curious that you said that.
Sure. I mean, I think you could and I say this with respect because we've all been there, but I think if you think of what it's like to go to a thronged art museum, say the Louvre, it's largely to see people walking by, or just, there's no, it doesn't, you could almost think of a museum as a kind of hospital for art, that you know, everything is in a kind of half state, of kind of fugue state of holding on, and then, you know, and it's important and great and everything, but that's all that it is. And it's fun, if that's the right word for me, to kind of, the first lecture I give every fall is about being called by works of art, and or just being called in general, and most everyone tends to be able to relate to that, and that's a way into it. It's possible to, you know, experience a work of art in its intense kind of address. That's a word I think comes up in your work. It does for me too. Address, like where you live, where your home is, but it also has to do with a kind of speaking that is an address, as opposed to like, yeah, whatever, it's great, it's awesome. No, it's an address, like the Gettysburg Address. And when you're called, you're addressed. You're coming home. And my point is just like we largely blow off even the possibility of that in the way even the art world, or maybe especially the art world so-called, presents what art is to us. It mediates it to us as just some interesting stuff, and then of course there's a collecting side and a marketing side to it, but you know, most all of the world exists in some kind of, we're alienated from it, we're alienated by our own categories of existence. For example, there's art and there's life over here. And so that's why we ask almost nothing of it. Yeah. Yeah, there's a question here.
They're excellent questions.
I was just going to ask you about Nancy Holt, how you felt about her work, and in particular, Sun Tunnels?
Yes. Love the work of Nancy Holt. The director of the Holt Smith Foundation, Lisa Lefauve, and I have been in a previous discussion and will be in another one at the end of the year. Nancy Holt, I admire her work so much, and it is in conversation with so much of what my own work is. Sun tunnels, dead stars, and I love how she orients her line of sight with the sun, with the stars, as compositions that incorporate a greater reality than the one that we're standing in, but it is the greater reality as well. I love her work, and thank you for bringing her up.
Thank you for what you just said earlier. It touched my heart as an artist, that about looking at art. It's a beautiful statement. For you, I'd like to go back to where you said you've altered your materials. And I'm curious about how that's changed in thinking about how it interacts in the world and sustainability and all of that stuff that you're thinking about.
Yes, so my working in metals has completely changed. So I'm no longer working in metals in the way that I did in the mid-2000s. I've started very large collaborations called Foundation Civilization, where we are working on materials that are in working with the carbon cycle, as we have a deeper understanding of our impact on the carbon cycle and what and how we can be part of that in a sustainable, responsible manner. My early interest in metals simply was because my palette was the periodic table of elements. And in order to be able to use temperature and pressure with those elements, I had to be working in metals. And then that made me delve deeply into metals. to then leave them and to continue on in now looking at the carbon cycle. So that's how kind of the evolution, it went from working in pigments to working in elements, and now working within the greater carbon cycle. Is that answering your question? So there are materials that are working with, one of the uses of the phrases I use is that the future is billions of years old. So it's coming into a working partnership with microbes. It's coming into a working partnership and an understanding of organisms that have already been part of this carbon cycle, seeing how they have contributed, how they mediate, what we can do with our materials in being able to share and understand that and continue that. Does that help? Oh, because just like from pigments to elements, you know, now I am entering into biology.
And last question.
You spent a lot of time talking about the materials and experimentation and collaboration with these wonderful people. So when the work is done, and I'm thinking of maybe your big public sculptures, what does it feel like then? And do you go back and visit these works all over the country, or have you released them and you move on, or what's that connection like?
It's a really good question. It's an intimate question too, because just as there's that depth within, and that depth of self, when I'm in my studio practice, I'm not as aware of a depth of self, right? It's a depth within. Then when there's the object out in the world, there is like a bit of a personal, how am I dealing with this? You know, right? That sense of how am I connecting with this? And I am still working with that. You know, there's actors in the world that say that they don't see their own films. You know, it's not that I'm not disconnected in that way, or that I don't take responsibility, or I don't have a sense of what is out in the world in that way. But I try to join it in the same way that anyone else would, and that is kind of how it is. There is a moment, definitely, with almost every work, maybe with the exception of a few, where I disconnect. I'm not connected to it in that way, and I am just a person. I'm just the material in contact with the material. That's true of me pretty much up and down the board.
Thank you all, and thank you, Christine.
All right, well, thank you all, and thank you for
Thank you.